AITA, my parents seized my apartment and forced me to pay them rent. I had to kick them out. I 25 male feel like I've stepped into some weird alternate reality, and I'm honestly not sure if I'm being totally unreasonable or if I'm seeing a side of my parents I never knew existed. Here's the story. Growing up, I always had what I thought was a close, loving, supportive family. My parents, both in their late 50s now, have always been really involved in my life. I was an only child, and they provided everything I could possibly need: education, guidance, a sense of security. They paid for my college, they put a roof over my head, and they fed me. And I always felt genuinely grateful. They never made me feel like I owed them anything. It was just understood that they were my parents, and that's what parents do. It was a loving, happy relationship, or so I thought. Even after I graduated and stayed with them for a bit while I looked for a job, they were totally okay with me staying at home. I wasn't freeloading, at least. I didn't feel like I was. I helped around the house, ran errands, and tried to be considerate of their space. They even encouraged me to take my time finding the right job. And then, about a year ago, I landed my first stable, full-time job. It didn't pay a lot, but it was enough for me to move out, which I did. They were thrilled for me, even helped me pick out furniture and make the space feel like my own. It felt like they were genuinely proud, happy I was becoming independent. I found a small, affordable apartment for myself. Nothing fancy, but it was mine. Moving out wasn't even about getting away from them. I love my parents. It was just about starting my own life, doing things my own way. And even after I moved, I still made a point of visiting them as often as I could. I'd take the train over to see them, have dinner, help out with things around their house, and just catch up. I started sending them a little money here and there whenever I could. They didn't need it, and they often tried to refuse, but I wanted them to know that I appreciated everything they'd done for me. Every once in a while, they'd let me pay for groceries or take them out to eat, and they seemed happy to know I was doing well enough to do these little things for them. Then, about a week ago, everything started to change. It was a Saturday afternoon, and I was just hanging out at my place, catching up on laundry and planning to maybe watch a movie. Suddenly, the doorbell rings. I wasn't expecting anyone, but when I open it, there they are, my parents, smiling and standing in the hallway with multiple suitcases and bags. They didn't even give me a heads up that they were coming, but hey, they're my parents, so I'm happy to see them. I invite them in, we sit down, and they start chatting about random things. After a while, though, I start noticing just how much stuff they brought. Like, it's an unusually large amount for a weekend visit. I ask them, what's with all the bags? They laugh and say they have a surprise for me. Now, I'm thinking, okay, maybe they brought me some stuff from my childhood or something. Or maybe they planned a trip for us, but nope. The surprise they're talking about is the fact that they've started renovations on their house and they plan to stay with me for the next few months. Just like that, without any warning, they tell me they're moving in temporarily. I'm trying to keep a smile on my face, but inside, I'm already freaking out. My apartment isn't huge, and it's barely set up for 2 people, let alone 3. I don't have extra rooms, and I wasn't mentally or physically prepared to host anyone for that long, not even my parents. But it's not like I can say no to them. They're my parents, and they've done so much for me. So, I swallow my surprise, act like I'm happy, and start clearing out some space for them. At first, things are okay. It's a little weird having them around all the time, but they're my parents, so it's not awful. I give them the bedroom, and I take the couch. They settle in, start making themselves comfortable, and pretty soon, it feels like I'm back at home with them. My dad's moving things around in my kitchen because he likes it set up a certain way. My mom's doing laundry, including mine, even though I tell her she doesn't need to. They start taking over more and more of my space, and it starts to feel like I'm the guest in my own apartment. But hey, I figured it's temporary, and they're family, so I can put up with a little inconvenience. Then, a few days later, everything changes. Out of the blue, they come to me and say they need to have a serious talk. I'm thinking, okay, maybe they're going to apologize for showing up unannounced, or maybe they're going to tell me they're leaving sooner than expected. But no, what they actually say leaves me absolutely speechless. They sit across from me, their faces a strange mix of seriousness and something that looks almost like resolve, as if they've rehearsed this, discussed it together, agreed on it ahead of time. They tell me they don't feel comfortable being guests here. It's a small statement, but the weight behind it feels massive, like there's so much more they're not saying. They explain that they're used to being in charge, the masters of the house, a phrase they say as if it's some kind of title, like they're accustomed to a level of authority that doesn't translate to my modest one-bedroom apartment. They tell me it feels wrong to be here without any control, any authority. I can feel a tension in their voices, like they're disappointed that the tables have turned, like they're struggling with the idea of not being the ones dictating the flow of the household. They're my parents, and I'm used to hearing them make decisions, but this feels different. It's like they're unsettled by the very idea of not having control over the space they're in, even though it's my apartment. Then, they hit me with their solution. They say it like it's some kind of clever compromise, a brilliant arrangement that'll keep everyone happy. They want me to pay them $1,000 a month. They present it as though it's some kind of mutually beneficial arrangement, as though it's the natural next step in our family dynamic. It takes me a second to even register what they're saying. I'm already paying my landlord $700 a month. My place isn't even worth $1,000 by any stretch, but they're sitting there, calmly insisting that's the fair market rate, with no hesitation or doubt. It's clear they've thought this through. They're convinced this is logical, reasonable even, and they're adamant that this isn't about the money, not really. They call it a way of balancing things out, as if our relationship has somehow been thrown off balance by my independence, as if the very act of moving out and building a life of my own has created some debt that I'm now expected to repay. They tell me it's only fair, given everything they paid for while I was growing up, my education, my food, my clothes, the countless other things that come with raising a child. They say it's time for me to contribute back to the family, that it's a natural part of adulthood. But it's more than that. There's this edge to their tone, a firmness, like they're laying down a law that I'm expected to follow without question. It's not a suggestion, it's a decree. They sit there, calmly explaining their logic, as though I should have seen this coming, as if my independence was always conditional. I just sit there, stunned, the reality of what they're saying sinking in slowly, painfully. They're literally asking me to pay rent in my own apartment, to pay them, of all people, just for the privilege of hosting them. I tried to explain, stammering at first, that I'm already paying rent to my landlord, that adding another $1,000 on top of that is impossible, unreasonable, borderline absurd. But they wave off my objections, insisting that this is about something bigger, that it's a matter of respect, of gratitude, of honoring the sacrifices they made. It's as if they believe this is some moral debt I owe them, as if everything they did for me growing up was a loan, a series of investments that I'm now expected to pay back. They say it so casually, as though it's perfectly normal for parents to ask their child for payment for years of love and support. I've never seen them like this before. They've always been kind, supportive, generous without expectation. They'd always made it clear that they didn't expect anything in return for raising me. That's what parents do, they'd said countless times. I'd always believed that, took it as a fundamental truth about our relationship. And now, in one conversation, they've turned all of that upside down, rewriting everything I thought I knew about my family. Suddenly, all those years of support and love feel like they came with strings attached, like there was a hidden clause in our relationship that I never knew about. To hear them say I owe them, simply because I'm their child, is almost surreal, like they're speaking a foreign language. I tried to stay calm and tell them that while I'm grateful for everything they've done, this is my apartment, and it doesn't make sense for me to pay them rent to live here. But they doubled down, saying I'm being ungrateful, that I'm not showing enough respect, and that they expected better from me. It's like they're laying a guilt trip on me for even questioning their request. They say that as their son, I owe them and that this is the least I can do after everything they've sacrificed. I'm completely lost. I feel betrayed, confused, and honestly a little hurt. I've always respected them and tried to show my gratitude in every way I could. And now it feels like none of that mattered, like I'm just some investment that they expect a return on. I don't know if I'm being stubborn or if they're the ones crossing a line here. Am I the asshole for refusing to pay rent to my parents in my own apartment, or are they the ones being unreasonable? Update 1. A few days after that initial conversation, when I was still reeling from the bizarre demand for rent, my parents brought it up again, only this time with more urgency. They cornered me as I was getting ready for work, telling me that I'd need to pay them for this month as well, since they'd already moved in and occupied their share of the apartment. The casual way they mentioned it, as if it were just a typical, everyday arrangement, was staggering. It was as if they couldn't even fathom how out of line this whole thing was, like they genuinely believed that charging me rent in my own apartment was a reasonable request. And I was supposed to just hand over my hard-earned money to them, money that I'd barely have left over after paying my actual rent so they could feel comfortable in my home. I was still trying to process the original request, still grappling with how to even respond, but now they'd raised the stakes, expecting me to pay right away. It was like I was living in some strange dream where everything was upside down and they had somehow convinced themselves that they were the rightful authorities here, that my own apartment was no longer under my control. I took a deep breath, steadied myself, and told them no, that I wouldn't pay anything, that it made no sense, and that it was unfair. The moment I said it, though, I saw a flicker of something I'd never really seen in them before. A kind of coldness, a sudden shift, as if my refusal had crossed some unspoken line. They didn't get angry right away, but they made it clear that they weren't about to drop this. They started telling me that it was my duty as their son to help them out, that they had given me so much over the years, and that this was how I could show my respect and gratitude. The entitlement in their tone shocked me. It was as if they believed that just by virtue of being my parents, they were automatically owed everything I had. They didn't care that I'd spent the past year trying to be independent, trying to show them that I was grateful in every other way possible. No, they wanted this specific form of payment, and they weren't going to back down. When I stood my ground and refused again, they doubled down, saying that I was disrespecting them, that I had an obligation to honor everything they'd done for me by following their wishes, and somehow, in their twisted logic, this meant paying them a rent that they themselves had invented, in my own apartment. They even brought up all the times they'd paid for me over the years, the sacrifices they'd made. They spoke as if everything they'd done for me, every gift, every opportunity, was now a debt that I was obligated to repay. And, somehow, this $1,000 per month was their price tag. A few days went by, and the tension was suffocating. My own home didn't feel like mine anymore. Every time I came home from work, they'd taken over more of the space. They'd rearranged my furniture, stocked the fridge with food they preferred, set up their own routines as if they planned to be there indefinitely. My apartment had become unrecognizable. I felt like a stranger there. They'd even started to suggest changes to my schedule, telling me when it would be better for me to go to work, when I should come back, even how to organize my belongings to suit their preferences. The subtle ways they tried to establish control over my life were infuriating, and every time I tried to push back, they just reminded me that I owed them. I was their son, after all, and they were only trying to help me by instilling this sense of responsibility. The breaking point came when they told me I'd either need to pay the rent or find another place to live. It was as if they'd completely forgotten that this was my apartment, that I was the one with the lease, the one paying the landlord every month. They acted like they were the rightful owners, that they had the authority to dictate where I should go and what I should pay. The worst part was, they didn't seem to care how absurd it was. They believed they were in the right, that I should be the one to either comply or leave. The way they talked, you'd think I was some kind of tenant who'd overstayed his welcome. It didn't matter to them that I'd built a life here, that this was my sanctuary. They didn't seem to care that they'd barged into my space without notice, without any respect for my boundaries. I felt like a guest in my own apartment, tiptoeing around my own things, unable to truly relax, constantly reminded that I was supposed to be paying them, even though they had no actual right to demand it. That night, as I lay on my couch, the one place I still felt I had a shred of control over, it hit me just how wrong this whole situation was. My own parents were essentially trying to evict me from my own home. They'd come into my life, my space, without so much as a warning, and now they were acting like they could call all the shots. They didn't even care how I felt about it, how uncomfortable it made me. To them, this was about asserting some bizarre version of authority over me, regardless of the emotional toll it took. And the worst part was, there was no reasoning with them. Every attempt I made to explain how absurd their demands were just fell on deaf ears. Eventually, I couldn't take it anymore. I felt trapped, suffocated, like I was slowly losing every shred of autonomy I'd worked so hard to build. And so, after another tense day of them treating me like I was some ungrateful kid who owed them for their love and support, I made a decision. I couldn't keep living like this. I packed an overnight bag and left. I didn't even tell them where I was going, I just left. I checked into a hotel nearby, needing a place where I could breathe, think, and, most importantly, feel like myself again. There was sadness, anger, and a lingering disbelief at how things had turned out. But there was also a profound sense of relief. For the first time in days, I felt like I could actually relax, without the constant pressure, without the looming feeling that I was being controlled in my own home. I still couldn't believe it had come to this. Update 2. After that night in the hotel, I had a lot of time to think. I was angry, hurt, and, most of all, exhausted from feeling like a stranger in my own life. My parents had crossed so many lines, twisted so much of what I thought our relationship was, that I couldn't even make sense of it. It was as if they had rewritten every rule we'd ever had, every understanding about family, trust, and respect. They believed they could simply dictate terms, take over my space, and twist my life into a version that suited them. But I knew I couldn't keep letting this happen. I'd worked hard to get here, to live independently, and I wasn't about to give all of that up just because my parents suddenly decided they had authority over my life again. So I decided to take action. I needed clarity on what my actual rights were, and I knew that no matter how close I was to my parents, it was time to get a legal perspective. I scheduled an appointment with a lawyer, determined to figure out exactly where I stood in this situation. I explained everything: the unannounced arrival, the bizarre demand for rent, their claim that they were the owners of my apartment, despite the fact that I held the lease. The lawyer listened carefully, and when I finished, he looked at me with a kind of knowing nod that gave me my first glimmer of hope. He explained that as the official tenant on the lease, I had full legal rights to the apartment. It didn't matter that my parents were my family or that they'd supported me in the past. This apartment was legally my home for as long as I upheld the lease. He confirmed that I could absolutely challenge any attempts to take over my space or disrupt my living situation. In fact, he said that my parents had no standing to make any demands on me, let alone charge me extra rent. If they pushed things further, I had every right to defend myself in court, should it come to that. Walking out of that lawyer's office, I felt a newfound confidence and determination. I wasn't going to let my parents walk all over me, no matter how much they tried to guilt-trip me or use family obligations to manipulate me. Armed with this knowledge, I decided it was time to confront them and put an end to this madness. When I got back to my apartment, I realized I'd left my keys inside. I knocked on the door, expecting them to let me in right away. But for a long moment, there was nothing, no response. I knocked again, louder this time, feeling a rush of frustration building. I knew they were inside, likely wondering why I was back or trying to assert some kind of power over me by not answering. Finally, after a few tense moments, the door opened just a crack, and I saw my father's face, a mixture of surprise and, oddly enough, defiance. It was clear they hadn't expected me back so soon, if at all. I pushed my way inside, not bothering to ask permission, because this was my apartment, and I was done letting them make me feel otherwise. Without any pleasantries, I launched straight into the reality of the situation. I laid it all out: their behavior, their attempts to take control of my life, their insistence that they were the owners of this apartment. And then I dropped the bombshell. I told them I'd consulted a lawyer, someone who had explained in no uncertain terms that what they were doing was completely out of line and, frankly, illegal. I told them that, as the tenant named on the lease, I had full rights to the apartment, and they couldn't demand rent or dictate terms. They couldn't just decide to take over my space because they felt like it. Legally, I had every right to challenge their actions, even take them to court if they continued to interfere. I could see the shock flicker across their faces. They hadn't expected me to go this far, to stand up to them in a way that made it clear I was serious. For a moment, they looked at each other, probably wondering if I was bluffing. But I stood firm, refusing to back down. Then, as if doubling down on their belief that they still had power over me, they tried to brush it off, claiming everything I'd said was nonsense and insisting that I owed them respect and obedience, that I had to pay them because they were my parents, and that's just how it was. But this time, I wasn't moved. I told them that if they were going to treat me like a tenant or worse, they needed to go back to their own home and leave me in peace. I reminded them that I wasn't a child under their roof anymore, and that by invading my space and trying to impose rules on me, they'd forfeited the respect they were demanding. They looked stunned, as if they couldn't quite process what I was saying. It was as if they'd never once considered that I might actually stand up to them, that I'd refused to let them bulldoze over my independence. When they realized I wasn't backing down, their expressions shifted. They looked genuinely taken aback, maybe even a little hurt, but I couldn't let myself feel guilty. They'd pushed me to this point, disregarded my autonomy, and tried to manipulate me into submission. So I held my ground, insisting that they either leave peacefully or face the reality that I would go to court if I had to. I told them, calmly but firmly, that they'd overstayed their welcome and that this was no longer their home, it was mine. There was a long, uncomfortable silence as they tried to process everything I'd just said. I could see their disbelief, their shock, and maybe even a glint of shame, though they wouldn't acknowledge it outright. Slowly, without a word, they began to gather their belongings. Watching them pack up felt surreal. I had never imagined a day when I'd be asking my own parents to leave my home. It felt strange, but it also felt necessary. They packed in silence, occasionally glancing my way, as if searching for some sign that I'd change my mind, that I'd apologize or beg them to stay. But I stayed resolute, determined to reclaim my space and the life I'd worked so hard to build. Finally, they finished packing, bags in hand, looking defeated but still holding on to their pride. They didn't say much as they walked out, just a brief, almost stunned goodbye, as if they couldn't quite believe what had just happened. As the door closed behind them, I felt a strange mix of emotions. There was a sadness, an undeniable sense of loss, but there was also a weight lifted, a freedom I hadn't realized was missing until now. My apartment, my life, was mine again, and I felt stronger, more independent, and more sure of myself than ever. I knew this would probably put a strain on my relationship with them. They would need time to process what had happened, and I would need time to rebuild my boundaries, to fully embrace my independence. But as I stood there in the quiet of my own apartment, finally alone, I knew I had done the right thing. I'd drawn a line, I'd fought for my autonomy, and, for the first time, I truly felt like an adult in control of my own life.